The Time of the Writer. Ingia ni bingelele nonke. Joanne Joseph is like an intimate family member, always in our homes, always in our cars, even if she's transported there just through the airwaves. Somebody just very highly regarded in the media industry, among her peers and among her various audiences. She was the melodic and comforting voice, the charming face that talked us through the moments when we were bidding Madiba goodbye, and there she was speaking to an international audience. So that persona of Joanne Joseph we know very well, and there's that formidable intimacy we have, Joanne, with your media role. But you've given us something really very special now in your writing. And you're not new to writing, in that you've published previously your book earlier that was a work of non-fiction, Drug Muled, sold well over 10,000 copies. And if we look now, Children of Sugarcane is destined for very much that. So welcome to the Time of the Writer. Time of the Writer has been waiting for you, Joanne, because what you've written here is very much in the theme of this year's Time of the Writer, Beyond Words. So, toutes nos félicitations. C'est bien de t'avoir dans ce festival. Bienvenue. I know that you would catch all of that because other than media and writing, you're also an MA in modern European languages and literature. So you're a Renaissance woman, and I hope that that introduction is enough to be able to say a little bit more about you than many of our readers and listeners on this program might have been privy to thus far. So welcome to the Time of the Writer, the University of KwaZulu-Natal's well-established program. And we're especially keen that this program is hosted in this UNESCO City of Literature, Durban. So it's wonderful. So last time I glanced at you, Joanne, you were right up there next to Jeffrey Archer and Damon Galgut. And that was in the bookshop. And I think that was quite a formidable accomplishment. I mean, has it pleased you how audiences and readers have lapped up Children of Sugarcane?
Kiru, thank you, not just for that question, but that lovely introduction. I think you're more a praise poet than a presenter in this hour, and I'm very, very grateful to you for that flattering introduction. Thank you. Yes, and I felt very fortunate. I have felt really so warmly towards readers who have contacted me over the last few months, the bookshops themselves, the retailers, and everyone else who has consumed Sugarcane, including the critics, the historians, and so forth. My heart is really warmed by the reception that this book has received. And of course, you always hope that whatever book you put out there will be well received by the public. But I think I've really been overwhelmed by how kind and generous everyone has been in having taken the time to read this book, first of all, in having bought it, and in having just been open to the ideas that were presented in this book. So I'm very, very grateful indeed, Kiru.
Well, let me be waving it, because it's always a great joy to see your cover. And the detail that's in this cover is also some profound meaning that's gone into this design. Well, let me turn back to my notes, unless you want to say something about the cover itself and the evolution of that cover, Joanne.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. I mean, we started off with quite a different cover, Kiru, and I haven't spoken about it much. So perhaps it is something interesting to allude to. But the original idea around it was a kind of illustrated cover, because quite a number of the historical fiction novels, or contemporary fiction novels in general, are adopting the idea of the illustrated cover. And I felt a little bit differently about this. There were lots of samples presented to me, but I said to my publisher, Nkanyezi Jabalala, I would really like a photographic cover. This is important to me because I wanted to occur to the reader that this is not just a fictional story. It is a story that draws on historical fact. And so I would like some element of photography in it rather than merely an illustrated cover. And she was so accommodating, as was my graphic designer. And she said to me, you know, your cover actually it's a bit like choosing a wedding dress. You must be completely 100% satisfied with your cover. And so we refined that cover, and with the help of friends, in particular one friend, Krivani Pillay, whom you may know from the media as well, an old stalwart of the media who now works for the United Nations, but she was the one who helped me to refine that cover and said to me, no, the sari ought not to be this color. We need a white sari because that was the convention of women who worked in the sugarcane fields. You know, we need her to be barefooted. And it was just that level of detail that she gave me. This is what sugarcane looks like after it's been dried or after it's been harvested. So this is what your sugarcane should look like. And it was that level of detail, her input from having grown up on a sugarcane farm, that actually enabled the cover to, I suppose, to be improved to the level that it finally was.
I mean, there's tremendous level of detail in that. I mean, the prose is marvelous, don't get me wrong, but you know, we do judge a book by the cover, and we look for meaning in images. And you know, as I look at this, I mean, just that fact of the erratic bundle of sugarcane, you know, just sprouting in all directions. There's nothing stylistic or straight as an illustrated cover might have. So there's something about that, about work that I see in it. But a quick observation about the sari itself. I mean, we joked in Chatsworth, where I grew up, that if somebody wore their sari a little above their ankles, we call that the flood sari. Okay? The flood sari, because you had to hitch your sari up to wade through a flood. But more importantly, it was about working people. You know, if it was a woman of leisure in a silk sari, it would drag on the floor, but the working people hitched that up. So I think when I fix the gaze on this cover, I need not read the prose in that sort of detail to be able to see the meaning in that way. But I'm running away with myself. This is about talking about your book here. I wanted to read you a little quote from the author Maya Shanbag. And I want to just glance down at my notes. And she says here, fiction is like listening to someone's heartbeat through a stethoscope. Memoir is like open heart surgery and holding someone's heart in your hands. Yeah, I think I like the sound of it. Memoir is like open heart surgery and holding someone's heart in your hands. Has sugarcane given voice to the women of indenture? Is Shanti living vicariously through your keyboard?
Kiru, such a beautiful quote. It really gives me goosebumps to hear that quote. And I'm going to go back and look for it. Please do send it to me after the session, because I think it really, quite literally, gets to the heart of what memoir is about. And I hope so. One hopes to resurrect people through words, as I came across that line in the what is it, the Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams, excuse me for that. It's on page 31. It's a reference to words being tools to resurrect the dead. And I see historical fiction very much that way. But I think historical fiction is so special because it allows us to do a couple of things. It allows us to, first of all, to resurrect that period. So we've got a backdrop that hopefully is an informative and educational context for the reader. But it also takes us to the heart of the human beings. It gives us that, what we would call in news and current affairs, a case study. And that case study brings us face to face with the human beings of the time, allows us to delve into the minutiae, the most trivial things in their lives. But in order to recreate that world, we do it through the humanity of the characters that we try to recreate. So for me, when you talk about memoir being the beating heart of fiction, to me, it's about resurrecting these characters. It's about literally squeezing that heart in your hand till you make the past breathe again, till you give it a beating heart, till you get the blood running through its veins again in a way that allows the reader to be able to connect with this person on a most human level as someone who is once again alive for the time that the reader is engaging that text.
Oh, that's beautifully put. Now, I want you just to develop this idea further, maybe through just telling us about some of the characters. You speak about ordinary people having agency. You know, we're just so used to all the great and the good being the voices we hear, but ordinary people having agency. Just maybe talk us through some of that, why that was an important idea for you, and how some of the characters receive agency through you in that regard.
Kiru, it was quite an interesting exercise going back to that time and the kind of historical recording of how indenture happened. I looked at that, I looked a bit at slavery, at other systems of oppression as well, in which you've got this idea, this very binary idea in a lot of older literature about the good and the bad, you know, the oppressed who is the victim, and the victor who is the oppressor. And I began to realize that there's a greater deal of nuance that ought to be embedded in this kind of writing. I don't believe, for example, that people who came here as indentured laborers lacked complete agency. Of course, it was a horrific system that some of them consciously bought into, created by the difficulties in India set in motion by the British, which essentially compelled them to look for life in new surroundings where they might be able to build better lives for themselves and their families and find new opportunities. But I began to read these incredible stories, and those come from the existing canon, which is a very small canon of South African indentured literature, whether it's the historical literature that you and others have so well documented, or whether it was the fictional literature, which has arisen out of that, and sadly has not had the publicity and the airtime that it so well deserves. But there were beautiful stories like Gurmit tales, for example, that talk about women, women who decided to leave India for all sorts of reasons, women who became widows and had their records expunged because their husbands were dead, women who were escaping gang rape from those contexts, women who had entered into such abusive marriages and had entered such abusive families that they were simply unable to imagine a continued life for themselves and their children within that context. And so it is at that point that those women do actually exercise agency, and they do want to leave those lives behind them. I mean, there's a character in my novel, as you know, who escapes because he was part of the rebellion, the Indian mutiny, that resulted in his having become criminalized by the acts of turning on the British, killing a number of them, and having to escape to some other destination, which he decided was going to be Africa. So in and amongst the stories of people who were literally hit over the head and put on a ship and woke up on a ship and found themselves on their way to Africa and various other British colonies, there were stories of people who made the choices of leaving. And in a way, the framework and the system of British colonization is a horrific one. It's deeply oppressive, it is deeply subjugating, and yet there are still individuals within it who find some measure of agency to improve their own lives, and the lives of their own children. And as a result, even if we see them as tragic figures, I see them more as tragic heroes and heroines of these stories.
I think that's beautifully said, and those nuances that you've captured so well, I think that brings a powerful storyline together. And you know, when I read your book, and I've read it now the second time, and I seem to see a braided technique that propels this powerful storyline. You combine so many different textures, so many different a kind of textured experience of history. Now, is that part of the craft of writing historical fiction? And can I just say, just acknowledge all the people with the comments that are coming through. You know, with age, these looks stay nicely, but the eyesight goes, and I can't read all of the comments that are there, but thank you very much. And I'm sure that after this, we'll reply to more of them. And let me also just digress for a commercial break and say thank you to Ismail Mohammed and all of the team at the Time of the Writer for giving us this kind of platform and introducing us to all these wonderful writers. So you guys do wonderful things for literature in our city, this UNESCO city, and of course in the world itself. But let's pick up that line about this braided technique as part of the craft of writing historical fiction, Joanne, if you could.
Kiru, I think I just had a lot to say. Determined that this was my one shot at telling the story of indenture. I'm not convinced I'm going to write another book. And I thought, let me just include as many of the issues that plagued me as a writer after learning about indenture as I possibly could. And I think all stories, very much like life, are stories that have a sort of macro plot, but also driven in many ways by subplots. That's the story of our lives, right? On the one hand, you are Kiru Naidoo, the historian, and you can be defined by all of your achievements, but also the father, the husband, the person who writes the books, the person who is engaging the 1860 Heritage Center, and that part of his life. You've got all these subplots in your life as well. And that is really the essence of all human life. And I tried to create writing as many of these subplots as possible. There were some I still feel I missed out on. I mean, I tried to make the book as dense and layered as possible. And I thank you for reading it twice, because I think with all books, particularly historical fiction, particularly when I'm studying these texts, I will go back and read them a number of times because it was the author's intention, of course, to layer this in many ways. And sometimes you don't get the first few, or you only get to the first few layers in your first reading and discover the remainder of the layers later on. But I think, indenture was just so vast. I mean, there were stories about a very good friend of mine, for example, is gay. And he said to me, that was one more aspect of it that you could have explored. And I grappled with that. And I didn't have enough, I felt I didn't have enough of a hold on the subject of homosexual relationships during indenture for me to venture into that. But certainly now when I look at Children of Sugarcane, I think, yes, that's another thread that's missing from it, So there are so many threads to pick up on and to pull together in a history as vast as this, one that lasted so many decades. And I felt that I really hope that I've done justice to most of the themes, but I think there are many more that I could have included, actually.
Well, you've ventilated so many themes that have not come to light over the passage of time and space, and I want to congratulate you for that. But just on that last point, I mean, homosexuality is a subject rarely spoken about in conservative societies, and I think more especially of people of Indian origin are very shy about this. But if you draw parallels, I mean, between Indian indenture with this huge percentage of men that were shipped to the colonial plantations, draw parallels with the African migrant labor system and the fact of men being corralled in these hostels for months and months on end. I think, those kinds of relationships are inevitable, as they were in the sugar barracks, they were in the hostels of mining compounds. Yeah, but that would be a fascinating PhD subject for somebody, I'm sure, and I'm sure the records will be helpful in that regard. Well, I want to turn you in another direction now. I'm a stamp collector, one of that rare and dying breed. So when you talk about how the envelope was opened to prize out the letter, I'm just intrigued about letters as a tool and the way you intersperse letters into the prose. I mean, was that a technique here again of connecting time, space, and very importantly, a written record, because letters remain with us? Was that a deliberate technique?
So Kiru, I think I lost you there for a moment, but I think I know where you're going with that question. And it wasn't, I apologize, my internet connection seems to be a little bit unstable, but I hope I'm still with you. The letters brought back for me just a dying art that we've just kind of lost a connection with in this day and age. I wanted the letters, first of all, to give a sense of the time in which people were communicating and just that sense of distance that occurred then. Space and time seem to have melted away in the modern world because we can send an email. I can be sitting in another country. I can reach you within 10 seconds of your having received that email. And therefore space doesn't exist, and nor does time exist in many ways. I can get on a plane to come and visit you. And although you and I are in different cities, within a space of 50 minutes, I can be sitting next to you almost. And I wanted to give a sense of that great distance, the sort of vast cavernous distance that existed between people at that time, and how that letter becomes such a deeply important form of human connection. It connects people across time. It connects migrants to their families. It connects people to cultures that they've lost. It connects people to locations and milieus out of which they've been ripped. And it, so the letter becomes also the voices of characters that you're not hearing directly. So much of the book is written in the third person. There are parts of it, small sections of it, that are written in the first person, but actually the bulk of it is written in the third person. And the letters are where you hear the voices of people directly contacting each other and connecting with each other in a way, without the writer almost mediating that experience for the reader. And I hoped that would be the most important role of those letters.
No, I think, and I hope that we might be encouraging people to write more letters now through that. Yeah. Well, let me move on to another line of argument. And here, at the risk of blowing more bubbles, I must tell you that one of the most compelling books that I've read on this subject, let's say over the past decade, was Gayatri Bahadur's Kuli Woman. And I think that was one of the just, compelling in the sense that it was the woman's voice. And there I am now reading Sugarcane, and I see that powerful voice again, the woman's voice coming through. And the question I want to put to you was, how painful was it writing about the violations of the woman's body that was so common in indenture as it was in slavery? And I want to just read a line from the book where you say, Lakshmi, and incidentally as my mother's name, Lakshmi returning from her medical examination, and she says this, I've just given birth. I'm not even allowing my husband under my sari. But now I have a strange white man putting his hands in there. It gave me a chill reading that. And and I'm sure that yourself as a descendant of these women abused and murdered on the plantations, I'm certain that must be something that was not just easy turning into prose.
Kiru, it was very difficult writing some of it. I must admit to you that I cried through a lot of the writing of the early drafts because, first of all, I think a lot of people know by now that this narrative was partly inspired by my great-grandmother's life. Adilakshmi Velanayakan was my great-grandmother who came from Salem in India, what is now Tamil Nadu, what was then the Madras Presidency. And she would have come here. She was employed on the Natal government railways. So life would have been extremely difficult for her. And so I had this very, very important human connection to my great-grandmother that I was very conscious of while I was writing the entire time. So for me, the characters were very real because I have imbued a number of them with the kind of characteristics I thought that my great-grandmother might have had in order to survive indenture and in order to thrive and have a family and educate her children and set about building a better life for them and better prospects for them. And so I was all too aware that even though I was putting on the page a fictional story, that it was also emanating from what historians like you have pulled out of the archives. That work has been very painstaking, and I must pay tribute to you and all your colleagues, Ashwin Desai, Golan Baya, Tembisa Waichen, Uma Dupilia Mestre, Kilpana Hiralal, a range of historians. And please forgive me for the names I've left out, because I've drawn on a lot more sources as well. But those figures have been very, very influential in opening up those stories to me in a way that became so real. And so a lot of the stories that you read in Children of Sugarcane have been fictionalized in terms of the names that have been given to them, in terms of perhaps the context in the real. These atrocities were, what can I say, visited upon or committed, and against whom these atrocities were committed. And I was all too aware of it, that I was simply giving them a different name, but this had happened to them in real life. And that was what got to me during the writing of this, that these women had suffered in ways that I could not imagine. And that here I am sitting in modern day South Africa in a constitutional democracy, in a privileged position, because of all of these, the series of events and the series of hardships and suffering that our ancestors had experienced and survived. And there's an immense amount of not just pain and trauma that one experiences in that moment or relives in that moment, reliving their lives, but also immense gratitude for what they went through and for what they allowed us to enjoy in this democracy, because all of those have been stepping stones to the lives we have today. So that was, I must admit, not an easy exercise at all from an emotional point of view.
Well, Joanne, thank you for those kind words and the encouragement for all of the people. And there are legions of people who do this kind of research. And I'm especially encouraged by the fact of how school children have started once again to take projects around indenture and around the experiences of their foremothers and forefathers. And I think that's an area of work that we must encourage, and not just peculiar to the Indian experience or people of Indian origin in South Africa, but right across the spectrum. You know, Shantanu Naidoo did this brilliant book, Women in Solitary. And, you know, just the fact of unearthing those stories, I hope that, you know, the grandchildren, especially the granddaughters of these women, would go out and research about their grandmothers and mothers who worked in the textile factories, the shoe factories, and so on. There's just so much of history right across our nation with that. But when you were talking about the characters just now, I'm just seeing things popping up on the screen. So let's acknowledge all of the people who are putting up comments here. We can't address them directly, but wherever they're complimentary of Joanne's work, thank you very much. I'm sure she loves hearing that kind of feedback, as you know, it's the stuff that enriches authors, the feedback from the readers. So thank you for that. And it's another word of thanks to the team at Time of the Writer putting all of this together. Just on the characters, I know that the identities of the actual persons, they're very thinly concealed. You know, when I look at names like Wilson and Rawlings and Nagama and those very specific experiences, I have a sense of where, you know, from the archival work where you've pulled that up. But I don't think you fictionalized them that much. We can see those stories, those actual stories of violence of every possible sort. So this just, you know, even in the sound of the names, Rathbone and Rawlings and so on, was that again something deliberate, that you didn't want to lose anything in history and you wanted those scoundrels to account in the pages of Sugarcane?
What better way to hold them to account, Kiru, as modern day readers and writers? I mean, there's just such a lot that needs to be accounted for, and we have not held our oppressors accountable, let's be honest, and several generations have passed on without that accountability in South Africa. And I think that's partly why our country is still hurting so badly, and partly accounts for the violence in our countries, that we're angry people. We are people who are hurt and who are traumatized as a nation. And it was important to highlight those characters in the same way as I was hoping to give the oppressed characters, the subjugated characters, the opportunity to talk back, to tell their story, to exercise their anger and their rebellion and their resistance in ways that—
The empire writes back.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that writing post-colonial historical fiction allows us that prerogative, which is such a privilege in a way. But I also wanted the opportunity to lash back at the very people who had perpetuated colonization and its culture, its denigrating culture. I wanted to be able to expose the individuals who had set that system in motion, who supported it, who perpetuated it, and who essentially endorsed it and allowed it to dominate and become the hegemonic culture of the time and of many centuries to come. It was important to expose the cruelty, the human rights abuses, but also the kind of attitude that colonization took towards the spaces it invaded. So, I mean, Eusebius Makaiser has written such a beautiful review of Children of Sugarcane, which appeared in Times Live today. And he shared it with me a short while ago. What a privilege to have an analysis of it. But he talks very specifically about the brand of colonization that came to Africa in a specifically to colonize us, how they made us think about ourselves, about the kind of emotional and psychological damage that was done to us by these individuals. And he refers very much, he refers obliquely, but it's something that I covered in my master's thesis, the depiction of Sarah Baartman, and how the doctor who was examining her, George Cuvier, was extremely unscientific in his approach to her post-mortem. How he used the accounts of early pioneers who had arrived in this country to mold his scientific, or what was, I'm using that in inverted commas, but to mold his so-called scientific understanding of what her body told him, the narrative her body put out before him when he was examining it. So one of the things, for example, one of the examples he gives is he speaks about her labia being enlarged as part of the culture of African women engaging in sexual intercourse with animals, with monkeys, you know, and so it exposes colonization as deeply unscientific in its approach, right? Deeply mythological in its approach. The creation of the colonized subject as subhuman in order for them to legitimize a practice where they could come to our continents and civilize us, because that was seemingly what we needed as inferior beings. And it was important to try to expose that in this novel as far as possible. Expose, as the academics would refer to this in critical race theory, expose the arrival of the colonizers and their annexing of our continents as spaces of experimentation, laboratories of experimentation, in which they treated us as primitive beings that they had under a microscope.
Such a vicious history, and you know, it must be pleasing to everyone that the opening lines of our Constitution, the prominence there that's given to dignity, and the fact that, you know, through all of these generations of suffering from, you know, almost 400 years of colonialism and slavery in the Cape, and then indenture and migrant labor, and, you know, the Natives Land Act and dispossession and all of that, that we can now have a system where we can look to restore dignity. And regrettably, we don't get that right most of the time, but that's the challenge, that we come from a deep and wounding history. And that's why I think writing like this is just such an important task. And Eusebius himself has done wonderful writing in it. And I must certainly look up what he wrote on Times Live today. Let's move. I see the clock's ticking away. We haven't been given reminders as yet. And thank you to more comments coming from there. Let's say hi back to Shauno and other people that are viewing this, this interview. I just want to look now at another terrain. I think that the simplicity of your dialogue is a very attractive feature of the book. And in the prologue, you made some reference to the dialogue. For instance, you know, I was very touched by these simple lines. And I see, there's Mikhail Pepas there, who's a great supporter of writing and the arts in our city. Let's greet him and the bunny cats out there, just keeping our society green and alive. Great work, Mikhail. We think about you fondly. And this line of the simplicity of the prose says, I was born a girl, but I now refused to think like this. We are both human, flesh and blood. You have caught a little more sun than me, that's all. Was the style, the simple style, important for conveying the message that you wanted to put out?
Kiru, it's such a difficult thing to decide upon when you're writing. You know, in those earlier first drafts are very verbose. I dread to look upon them again. Second iteration of Children of Sugarcane. But that's because long and arduous process for me to learn partly what kind of register I was going to use. So the language was very complex, very complicated, unnecessarily complicated, I think, in the first few drafts. And then I realized, and this I learned because I think good writers are avid readers. I went back and I read a whole lot of historical fiction, and I thought, you know, this is something that writers cheat, and they do it for a very specific reason. Sometimes language can be alienating. Sometimes it can obfuscate meaning rather than create meaning. And so one must be very careful about the register in which you read. And I thought, if I created a backdrop and a structure and a milieu that was firmly anchored in indenture and in colonization, then my readers would have enough of a sense that they are in this period, that once they open the book, they are being transported backwards into the 18th century or the 19th century, as the case may be. And I could simplify the language so that there's a kind of accessibility that allows people to read the story on any level they want. So if you don't feel like doing the hardcore analysis, you don't have to. It could just be a story about a young becoming a heroine within that situation. And if you wish to read it on other layers, and if you wish to analyze it as you have done and read it twice and look at it from a more academic point of view, that too is possible. But I realized that also, I mean, many of the people mentioned in the text, many of the characters are working class characters. They are the proletariat. Their lives are simple and their language is simple. And in some cases, just to give it a bit of variation and to remind people of the various registers that existed at that time. I have a character who speaks in a kind of neologisms, you know, the Indian dialect that has become familiar to us as Durbanites, who you know, whose ancestors hailed from India. There's a kind of Durban English that is quite remarkable and noticeable and easily recognizable. So I tried to retain a bit of that as well in terms of the registers and the dialects of the characters. So I think keeping it simple, I realized, and Stephen King insists on that. I'm, by the way, giving his memoir on writing a reread at this point, because sometimes you just need to be reminded about what constitutes decent writing. You know, he talks about keeping it quite simple. Don't use an adjective where you don't need to. Don't use adverbs where you don't need to. Keep it as simple and accessible as possible, and build the complexity into plotting and other things. Of course, I must admit, though, the writing is ornamented. And I did that quite deliberately because of the period in which it's written, in which the novel is set. And some people didn't like that. They found that a little too heavy for them. They said, no, they like much simpler writing than that. And that's absolutely their prerogative as a reader to judge the novel that way. But those were the sorts of ideas I played with in deciding how the characters were essentially going to speak in the book.
Well, I'm glad you've recorded so much of our language in this prose, because unless we write them down, language is something evolving all the time. In fact, even the Tamil that we speak in Durban is a creolized Tamil, almost unintelligible in southern India. So every bit of our language evolves, and it's left to writers to be able to gather all of that in this kind of manner. And I think you've done that with aplomb. I'm intrigued, though, about the multiple incarnations. Where are all of those manuscripts? And I hope that they're not lost and that those might be lodged in our archives. So like you've benefited from the records in the archives, somebody studying this work a few decades from now might get to see those different incarnations. Tell us about that.
You, Kiru, and certainly to have them sitting in an archive somewhere. Educated in the craft of writing, of this genre of writing. So, I'm a writer who came out of school into university, learned how to write as an academic. While I was still at university, I learned how to write for radio and television, a bit of documentary writing and so forth. So that was where my area of expertise lay. I can slap a new script together, breaking news script in record time and make sure there are no mistakes in it and it's factually correct and it's well written. But writing a historical fiction novel was extremely difficult for me. So I'll tell you why that is. It's partly because, I'd studied literature for quite a number of years. My honors and master's degrees were in literature, but in a way, you're looking in from the outside as a literature student. You are always exploring a world that is alien to you, and you are critiquing that world, and you are learning all sorts of things from that experience of reading. But the experience of writing means standing in that world, and in fact, standing in a blank space and creating that world around you, which is a very different exercise, and which is a very difficult exercise if you don't know how to do it. And so those earlier drafts of mine were just my stumbling around, stumbling through forests of words where the light was just not coming in. And so those drafts are deeply cumbersome. They're extremely tangled in terms of plotting. They're extremely cliched in some ways, and quite verbose, and quite predictable in terms of the way the plot unfolds as well. So my process, and that's literally why it took me 9 years, because I had to learn how to write a historical fiction novel.
You've just answered Puleng's question. Yeah. I'm sure you saw Puleng's question popping up there. All right, so good.
Hi, Puleng.
You've answered that part.
So 9 years, Puleng. It was a labor, and not always a labor of love. At the end of it, yes, it was a labor of love. Sometimes it was just a labor of frustration and irritation with myself, and the belief that this novel was never going to see the light of day because I was not capable of writing a historical fiction novel. And my confidence.
Well, we're very happy that it's seen the light of day, for sure. Yeah. Well, let me develop that angle a bit more. Let me ask it in this way. Is emotional stability necessary to write well? And I'm asking it because it was Hemingway who once said that he could only write well when in love.
I love that. My brother had a brilliant piano teacher who said there were some pieces you could not play unless you were in love, that there's certain Chopin pieces you needed to be in love to play. I find that I write best during periods of melancholia, and I don't think writers are stable people, and I don't think that's always a bad thing, because, we all have different muses, I suppose, but I found even on cloudy days or on rainy days, it was much easier to access this narrative and the characters than it was on bright, happy, sunny days, you know. One way that I used to access this, and I haven't even told my dad this, but I plan to have a long conversation with him when I see him in April about music and how
No, you're not going to
in
talk to him in
writing.
April. Joanne, you're not going to talk to him in April. You're going to sit down and write him a letter. Yeah, in your own hand, craft him a letter and tell him that story, but continue.
but Kiru, it was, it was very interesting for me to, there are particular chapters where there's quite a lot of death, where there is violence and where there's a lot of suffering and there's loss and there's tragedy. And I listened to, Keith Jarrett has recorded, the famous jazz pianist has recorded several years ago, a concert in Hungary, in Budapest more specifically. And it's one that was released after he realized he wasn't going to be able to play anymore because he had a stroke. And that's really debilitated him in a huge way. But there were pieces from that album that I kept going back to and I kept listening to. And one of them was It's a Lonesome Town. And that spoke to me about the alienation of indenture. I mean, it's a very modern work, but it put me in the frame of mind. It depressed me, actually, to the point that it put me in the frame of mind to be able to write certain chapters that involve that tragedy and loss. There's another chapter called the piece that he plays on that album called Answer Me. And I use that as the basis for the relationship between my protagonist Shanti and the love of her life, Mustafa, and the difficulties they encounter in their relationship. So no, that's the long answer to your question as to whether emotional stability is required. I don't think it is. Sometimes it's even a stumbling block, but it helps to be able to return to moments of stability and rationality, where you can step back and look at your manuscript in a more objective way and see whether it actually works or not.
Great. Yeah, we're just counting down. I see it's something like 10 minutes for this conversation. So let's thank all of the people who are joining us online and acknowledge again the Time of the Writer at UKZN, Ismail Mohammed and his wide team. And I was just so pleased to hear, Joanne, that he's mobilized so many interns who've done wonderful things, everything from all of these animations. I mean, you look delightful in the animations, but I didn't recognize myself there. But all of that, I think it's just brought such an excitement to this love of writing and books, and something that the Time of the Writer keeps up with great aplomb. And we must applaud all of that in this UNESCO City of Literature. And of course, all of the partners that have joined in ensuring that we have this great festival of writing in this UNESCO city. I want to, in the remaining time, just tap some of the themes that you've already looked at in part. And I just want to go back to my notes here, in which I say, this is an important addition to the growing body of literature on migration, person and place, dislocation, identity, alienation, and similar themes. Now, I just wanted to ask whether is this a work about social justice, stimulating thinking, in your words, stimulating thinking about atrocities of the past? The sweat of a laborer fills my nostrils. You know, just reading those words again just made me so angry, but it also transported me back into that period. And whether it's slavery in the Cape, whether it's indenture, whether it's migrant labor or the oppression of domestic service, are we looking now at literature and a genre that's developing out of lived experience of oppression that might be a stab at social justice? Do you ever think of Sugarcane in that vein?
I hope it is, Kiru. I hope it does the work of that. One thing that I wanted to do, which fiction does beautifully, is to create empathy, because I think empathy is the first step to understanding. So when you talk about all these periods in the past in which people were deprived of their rights to justice, I think we're still living in a period where that's very much the reality. And so I think when you're writing a novel like this, you're conscious that you're writing about the past, but in a way you're writing about your present as well, because so many of those threads run from the past firmly into the present, and so many of those societal problems and injustices remain. And for as long as they remain unresolved, fiction in general, perhaps even a measure of objectivity that allows us to delve into the past in a safe way, well, safe up to a point, because of course it is somewhat emotionally draining to be tackling these subjects, even though one has the distance of sitting and reading them in the form of a book. I think it allows us to think in a bit more of an objective way about the issues that are plaguing our society today. So, for example, you talk about the issue of migrants, and we've got this wave of xenophobia that resurges every now and then, and I think we're in one of those waves as we speak. But are people asking the right questions, right? We've got the othering of many people happening, the othering of migrants who've come into our country right now. We've not necessarily got the right questions being asked about how they came to be here, why they left their countries, how easy it was for them to have left their loved ones behind, how they long to return to their countries, and how South Africa may just be a stopgap measure in order to keep them alive, in the same way that migrants in the past left their countries due to compelling circumstances that brought them here. And I hope that this can be used as a tool to build that kind of empathy, where we ask those kinds of questions. Shanti is able to talk about the life of a migrant, the complexities and the paradoxical nature of being a migrant, where you miss your home terribly, but you've had to leave it behind because of circumstances that drove you to. And yet you still have that connection to your home. You still wish to return home at some stage if everything is brought back to normal. You long for and you yearn for the culture of home, for the food of home, for the people of home. And yet, you are unable to access those things while you remain in that state of migration. So I'm hoping that the book will do a small measure of social justice work, simply in getting people thinking about those sorts of issues.
You have me beaming when you talk about the food of home. And when Mustafa is just such a beautiful character in the way you've brought him out. And there you talk about the simple food, dal and rice. And I think that that's a metaphor for so much of the lives of indentured workers. It's like having, pap and chakalaka because there isn't anything else to eat. The simple food in the simple life. We have just under 5 minutes remaining. So I think you've drawn so many of those metaphors, not just around the language you've employed, but also this thing of dal and rice. We have a community market in Chatsworth, and Kiru Naidoo and I are there most of the time. One of the most popular foods in that market is dal and rice with the sour herbs in it. And you know how that harks back to a bygone era, even though we might be able to afford lobster and fillets, steak and things, but dal and rice. I think it's just such a powerful metaphor of so much else about basic necessities. That's
I love
just
that
me fulminating. Yeah. Well, in the remaining minutes here, it's probably a hackneyed question that an author is always asked at the end, and you probably answered it at the beginning, that maybe you didn't have the resolve for another book. But I think you've been really invigorated by this kind of storyline. And there are lots of people in the world writing. There are just too few that are writing on the southern tip of Africa. So what will it take for us to just light a fire under you to do a sequel to Sugarcane now?
I'm not sure that there is a sequel, Kiru. The read and to finish it off in a way. And we know that reading is the re-encoding of a text, right? But I think the reader had to do quite a bit of work at the end of this. How does the story end? there isn't an answer to that. In my mind, I know how I'd like the story to end. And I think a lot of other readers would have wanted to end it that way. But there was someone who said to me, no, how dare you stop at that point? I want to know that everything is okay at the end, or I want a sequel. And I don't think there will be either, because I feel like the work of finishing the novel needs to be done by the reader. Because there's a lot for the reader to think about and process there, and I want to leave that. I want to lodge that responsibility firmly at the reader's feet. Having said that, there are so many other fascinating parts of history that interest me. And perhaps if I'm ever brave enough or silly enough to attempt another novel, perhaps I will explore another period of history that has grabbed my attention.
Well, let us wish you tons of ink to your pen, both for the letters to your father and the writing that you're going to do. And thank you for sharing this session with us. Joanne Joseph, author of Children of Sugarcane, and that's it up there. I think it's been a fascinating discussion we've had. It's always such a joy to share these thoughts with you. So let us say thank you to the various folks at the Time of the Writer and the audience that's joined us. We were in this UNESCO City of Literature, and I hope that now that we've had this great session with the Time of the Writer, that all of you who are interested in literature coming out of this city especially will join us at the Durban Book Fair and all of the other initiatives that we have going. So let us thank all of the writers, the audiences of readers, and all of you, again, who have organized this wonderful session. Thank you all very much, and thank you again, Joanne.
Thank you, Kiru. And I also just want to quickly extend my thanks to the Time of the Writer team for such a professional set of discussions, panel discussions. They've been so illuminating for me. It's been an education watching other writers on this panel, listening to the brilliant questions and answers that have been given. So I'm really grateful to be from that amazing city of literature, Durban, but also to have been educated by everyone else who has participated in this festival. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.